peaceful and relaxing. He watched them for a few moments and then sat up, feeling wet dew beneath his palms as he pushed himself upright. He saw that he was naked, and as he surveyed his surroundings, he lifted his hand to his face, smelling the sweet scent of the grass and the crystal freshness of the air. A vista of unsurpassed beauty lay before him. Towering snow-capped mountains draped in a shawl of pine and fir. Magnificent swathes of emerald-green forests as far as the eye could see, and a wide river of foaming, icy water. Hundreds of shaggy-coated herbivores grazed on the plain, and wide-pinioned birds circled noisily overhead. Horace sat on the low slopes of the foothills at the base of the mountains, the sun warming his face and the grass wondrously soft beneath him. "So that's it, then," he said calmly to himself. "I'm dead." No one answered him, but then he hadn't expected them to. Was this what happened when a person died? He dimly remembered someone teaching him of the ancient unbelief of heaven and hell, meaningless words that promised rewards for obedience and punishment for wickedness. He took a deep breath, scenting the aroma of good earth, the fragrances of a world unchecked and untamed, and of the living things that covered the landscape. He could taste the air and was amazed at its purity. Its crispness filled his lungs like sweet wine. But how had he come here, and where was here? He had been... where? He couldn't remember. He knew his name was Horace, but beyond that he knew only fragments and dim recollections that even now grew faint and insubstantial the more he tried to hold on to them. Deciding that he should try to find out more about his surroundings, he rose to his feet, wincing as his shoulder pulled tight, and he saw a spot of blood soak through the white woolen robes he found himself wearing. Hadn't he been naked a second ago? Horace put it from his mind and laughed. "There might be no hell, but this feels like heaven right enough." His throat was dry, and he set off towards the river, feeling the softness of the grass through newly sandaled feet. He was further away than he thought, the journey taking him longer than expected, but he didn't mind. The beauty of the landscape was worth savouring, and though something insistent nagged at the back of his mind, he ignored it and carried on. The mountains seemed to reach the very stars, their peaks lost in the clouds and belching noxious fumes into the air as he gazed up at them. Horace blinked. The after-image of dark smoke, wreathed peaks of iron and cement, burned onto his retinas like a spliced frame of harsh interference dropped into a mood window. He dismissed it as the newness of his surroundings and headed across the swaying plains of tall grass, feeling the bones and waste of uncounted centuries of industry crunching beneath his feet. Horace felt ash in his throat, now needing a drink more than ever, the chemical stink growing worse with each step. He tasted benzene, chlorine, hydrochloric acid, and vast amounts of carbon monoxide, lethal toxins to any but him, it seemed, and briefly wondered how he knew these things. The river was just ahead, and he splashed through the shallows, enjoying the biting cold as he reached down and scooped a handful of water into his cupped palms. The icy water burned his skin, molten slag dripping in caustic ropes between his fingers, and he let it splash back into the river, wiping his hands on his robe, which was now soot-stained and torn. He looked up and saw that the glittering quartz mountains had become vast towers of brass and iron, wounding the sky with gateways like vast maws that could swallow and vomit forth entire armies. Streams of toxic filth poured from the towers and poisoned the river, the landscape around it withering and dying in an instant. Confused, Horace stumbled from the river, fighting to hold on to the verdant wilderness that had surrounded him, and to hold back the vision of this bleak land of dark ruin and despair. He turned from the dark mountain, the cliff of deepest red and blackened iron, its top hidden in the high clouds above, and its base girded with boulders and skulls. He fell to his knees, expecting the softness of the grass, but landing heavily on a fractured hard pan of ash and iron, swirling vortices of dust rising up in great storms. "What's happening here?" shouted Horus, rolling onto his back and screaming into a polluted sky, striated with ugly bands of ochre and purple. He picked himself up and ran as though his life depended on it. He ran across a landscape that flickered from one of aching beauty to that of a nightmare in the space of a heartbeat, his senses deceiving him from one second to another. Horus ran into the forest. The black trunks of the trees snapped before his furious charge, images of lashing branches, high towers of steel and glass, great ruins of mighty cathedrals, and rotted palaces left to crumble under the weight of the ages dancing before his eyes. Bestial howls echoed across the landscape, and Horus paused in his mad scramble as the sound penetrated the fog in his head, the insistent nagging sensation in the back of his mind recognizing it as significant. The mournful howls echoed across the land, a chorus of voices reaching out to him, and Horus recognized them as wolf howls. He smiled at the sound, dropping to his knees and clutching his shoulder as fiery pain lanced through his arm and into his chest. With the pain came clarity, and he held onto it, forcing the memories to come through force of will. Howling wolf voices came again, and he cried out to the heavens, "What's happening to me?" The trees around him exploded with motion, and 100-strong pack of wolves sprang from the undergrowth, surrounding him, with their teeth bared and eyes wide. Foam gathered around exposed fangs, and each wolf bore a strange brand upon its fur, that of a black, double-headed eagle. Horus clutched his shoulder, his arm numb and dead as though it was no longer part of him. "Who are you?" asked the closest wolf. Horus blinked rapidly as its image fizzled like static, and he saw curves of armor and a single staring cyclopean eye. "I am Horus," he said. "Who are you?" repeated the wolf. "I am Horus," he yelled. "What more do you want from me?" "I do not have much time, my brother," said the wolf, as the pack began circling him. "You must remember before he comes for you. Who are you?" "I am Horus, and if I am dead, then leave me be," he screamed, surging to his feet and running onwards into the depths of the forest. The wolves followed him, loping alongside him and matching his steady pace as he lurched randomly through the twilight. Again and again, the wolves howled the same question until Horus lost all sense of direction and time. Horus ran blindly onwards until he finally emerged from the tree line above a wide, high-cliffed crater gouged in the landscape and filled with dark, still water. The sky above was black and starless, a moon of purest white shining like a diamond in the firmament. He blinked and raised a hand to ward his eyes against its brightness, looking out over the black waters of the crater, certain that some unspeakable horror lurked in its icy depths. Horus glanced behind him to see that the wolves had followed him from the trees, and he ran on as their howling followed him to the edge of the crater. Far below, the water lay still and flat like a black mirror, and the image of the moon filled his vision. The wolves howled again, and Horus felt the yawning depths of the water calling out to him with an inevitable attraction. He saw the moon and heard the company of wolves give voice to one last howled question before he hurled himself into the void. He fell through the air, his vision tumbling and his memory spinning. The moon, the wolves, Lupercal, Luna, wolves. Everything snapped into place, and he cried out, "I am Horus of the Lunar Wolves, War Master and Regent of the Emperor, and I am alive!" Horus struck the water, and it exploded like shards of black glass. Flickering light filled the chamber with a cold glow, the cracked stone walls limned with crawling webs of frost, and the breath of the cultists feathering in the air. Aksub had painted a circle with 8 sharp points around its circumference, on the flagstones in quicklime. The mutilated corpse of one of the Davinite priestess's acolytes lay spread-eagled at its center. Erebus watched carefully as the priestess's lodge thralls spread around the circle, ensuring that every stage of the ritual was enacted with meticulous care. To fail now, after he had invested so much effort in bringing the War Master to this point, would be disastrous, although Erebus knew that his part in the War Master's downfall was but one of a million events set in motion thousands of years ago. This fulcrum point in time was the culmination of billions of seemingly unrelated chains of circumstance that had led to this backwater world that no one had ever heard of. Erebus knew that this was all about to change. Davin would soon become a place of legend. The secret chamber in the heart of the Delphos was hidden from prying eyes by potent magic and sophisticated technology received from disaffected Mechanicum adepts, who welcomed the knowledge the word-bearers could give them, knowledge that had been forbidden to them by the Emperor. Akshab knelt and cut the heart from the dead acolyte, the lodge priestess expertly removing the still warm organ from its former owner's chest. She took a bite before handing it to Sepha, her surviving acolyte. They passed the heart around the circle, each of the cultists taking a bite of the rich, red meat. Erebus took the ghastly remains of the heart as it was passed to him. He wolfed down the last of it, feeling the blood run down his chin and tasting the final memories of the betrayed acolyte as the treacherous blade had ended her life. That betrayal had been offered unto the architect of fate, this bloody feast to the blood god, and the unlovely coupling of the doomed acolyte with a diseased swine had called upon the power of the Dark Prince and the Lord of Decay. Blood pooled beneath the corpse, trickling into channels cut in the floor before draining into a sinkhole at the center of the circle. Erebus knew that there was always blood. It was rich with life and surged with the power of the gods. What better way was there of tapping into that power than with the vital substance that carried their blessing? "Is it done?" asked Erebus. Akshab nodded, lifting the long knife that had cut the heart from the corpse.
"It is. The power of the ones who dwell beyond is with us, though we must be swift."
"Why must we hurry, Akshab?" he asked, placing his hand upon his sword. "This must be done right, or all our lives are forfeit."
"I know this," said the priestess. "There is another presence near, a one-eyed ghost who walks between worlds and seeks to return the son to his father."
"Magnus, you old snake," chuckled Erebus, looking up towards the chamber's roof. "You won't stop us. You're too far away, and Horus is too far gone. I have seen to that."
"Who do you speak with?"
asked Akshab. "The one-eyed ghost. You said there was another presence near."
"Near, yes,"
said Akshab.
"but not here."
Tired of the old priestess's cryptic answers, Erebus snapped, "Then where is he?" Akshab reached up and tapped her head with the flat of her blade.
"He speaks to the sun, though he cannot yet reach him fully. I can feel the ghost crawling around the temple, trying to break the magic keeping his full power out."
"What?" cried Erebus.
"He will not succeed,"
said Akshab, walking towards him with the knife outstretched.
"We have spirit-walked in the realm beyond for thousands of years, and his knowledge is a paltry thing next to ours."
"For your sake, it had better be, Akshab." She smiled and held the knife out.
"Your threats mean nothing here, warrior. I could boil the blood in your veins with a word, or rip your body inside out with a thought. You need me to send your soul into the world beyond, but how will you return if I am dead? Your soul will remain adrift in the void forever, and you are not so full of anger that you do not fear such a fate."
Erebus did not like the sudden authority in her voice, but he knew she was right and decided he would kill her once her purpose was served. He swallowed his anger and said, "Then let us begin."
"Very well,"
nodded the priestess, as Sepha came forward and anointed Erebus's face with crystalline antimony. Is this for the veil?
Yes,
said Akshub.
It will confound his senses, and he will not see your likeness. He will see a face familiar and beloved to him.
Erebus smiled at the delicious irony of the thought, and closed his eyes as Sepher daubed his eyelids and cheeks with the stinging silver-white powder.
The spell that will allow your passage to the void requires one last thing,
said Akshub. What last thing? Asked Erebus, suddenly suspicious.
Your death,
said Akshub, slashing her knife across his throat. Horus opened his eyes, smiling as he saw blue sky above him. Pink and orange-tinged clouds drifted slowly across his vision, peaceful and relaxing. He watched them for a few moments and then sat up, feeling wet dew beneath his palms as he pushed himself upright. He saw that he was fully armored in his frost-white plate, and as he surveyed his surroundings, he lifted his hand to his face, smelling the sweet scent on the grass and the crystal freshness of the air. A vista of unsurpassed beauty lay before him. Towering snow-capped mountains draped in a shawl of pine and fir, magnificent swathes of emerald-green forests as far as the eye could see, and a wide river of foaming, icy water. Hundreds of shaggy-coated herbivores grazed on the plain, and wide-pinioned birds circled noisily overhead. Horus sat on the low slopes of the foothills at the base of the mountains, the sun warming his face and the grass wondrously soft beneath him. "To hell with this," he said as he got to his feet. "I know I'm not dead. So what's going on?" Once again, no one answered him, though this time he had expected an answer. The world still smelled sweet and fragrant, but with the memory of his identity came the knowledge of its falsehood. None of this was real, not the mountains or the river or the forests that covered the landscape, though there was something oddly familiar to it. He remembered the dark iron backdrop that lay behind this illusion, and found that if he willed it, he could see the suggestion of that nightmarish vision behind the beauty of the world laid out before him. Horus remembered thinking, a lifetime ago it seemed, that perhaps this place might have been some netherworld between heaven and hell, but now laughed at the idea. He had long ago accepted the principle that the universe was simply matter, and that which was not matter was nothing. The universe was everything, and therefore nothing could exist beyond it. Horus had the wit to see why some ancient theologian had claimed that the warp was in fact hell. He understood the reasoning, but he knew that the Empyrean was no metaphysical dimension. It was simply an echo of the material world, where random vortices of energy and strange breeds of malign Xenos creatures made their homes. As pleasing an axiom as that was, it still didn't answer the question of where he was. How had he come to this place? His last memory was of speaking to Petronella Vivar and the apothecarian, telling her of his life, his hopes, his disappointments, and his fears for the galaxy, conscious that he had told her those incendiary things as his valediction. He couldn't change that. But he would damn well get to the bottom of what was happening to him now. Was it a fever dream brought on by whatever had wounded him? Had Temba's sword been poisoned? He dismissed that thought immediately. No poison could lay him low. Surveying his surroundings, he could see no sign of the wolves that had chased him through the dark forests, but suddenly remembered a familiar form that had ghosted behind the face of the pack leader. For the briefest instant, it had looked like Magnus. But surely he was back on Prospero, licking his wounds after the Council of Nicaea. Something had happened to Horus on Davin's moon, but he had no idea what. His shoulder ached, and he rotated it within his armor to loosen the muscle, but the motion served only to further aggravate it. Horus set off in the direction of the river once more, still thirsty, despite knowing that he walked in an illusory realm. Cresting the rise that then began to slope gently down towards the river, Horus pulled up sharply as he saw something startling. An armored Astartes warrior floating face down in the water. Wedged in the shallows of the riverbank, the body rose and fell with the swell of the water, and Horus swiftly made his way towards it. He splashed into the river and gripped the edges of the figure's shoulder guards, turning the body over with a heavy splash. Horace gasped, seeing that the man was alive and that it was someone he knew. A beautiful man was how Loken had described him. A beautiful man who had been adored by all who knew him. The noblest hero of the Great Crusade had been another of his epithets, Hastur Sejanus. Loken marched away from the temple, angry at what his brothers had done and furious with himself. He should have known that Erebus would have had plans beyond the simple murder of the War Master. His veins surged with the need to do violence, but Erebus was not here, and no one could tell Loken where he was. Torgadden and Vipers marched alongside him, and even through his anger, Loken could sense his friend's astonishment at what had happened before the great gate of the Delphos. "Throne, what's happening here?" asked Vipers as they reached the top of the processional steps. "Garvey, what's happening? Are the first captain and little Horus our enemies now?" Loken shook his head. "No, Nero. They are our brothers. They are simply being used, as I think we all are." "By Erebus?" asked Torgadden. "Erebus?" said Vipers. "What has he got to do with this?" "Garfield thinks that Erebus is behind what's happening to the War Master," said Torgadden. Loken shot him an exasperated stare. "You're joking." "Not this time, Nero," said Torgadden. "Tarek," snapped Loken, "keep your voice down or everyone will hear." "So what if they do, Garvey?" hissed Torgadden. "If Erebus is behind this, then everyone should know about it. We should expose him." "And we will," promised Loken, watching as the pinpricks of vehicle headlights appeared at the mouth of the valley they had only recently flown up. "So what do we do?" asked Vipers. That was the question, realized Loken. They needed more information before they could act, and they needed it now. He fought for calm, so that he could think more clearly. Loken wanted answers, but he had to know what questions to ask first, and there was one man who had always been able to cut through his confusion and steer him in the right direction. Loken set off down the steps, heading back towards the Thunderhawk. Torgadden, Vipers, and the warriors of Lacaster followed him. As he reached the bottom of the steps, he turned to them and said, "I need you two to stay here. Keep an eye on the temple and make sure that nothing bad happens." "Define bad," said Vipers. "I'm not sure," said Loken. "Just bad, you know. And contact me if you get so much of a glimpse of Erebus." "Where are you going?" asked Torgadden. "I'm going back to the Vengeful Spirit." "What for?" "To get some answers," said Loken. "Hastur!" cried Horus, reaching down to lift his fallen friend from the water. Sejanus was limp in his arms, though Horus could tell he lived by the pulse in his throat and the colour in his cheeks. Horus dragged Sejanus from the water, wondering if his presence might be another of the strange realm's illusions, or if his old friend might in fact be a threat to him. Sejanus's chest hiked convulsively as he brought up a lungful of water, and Horus rolled him onto his side, knowing that the gen-enhanced physique of an Astartes warrior made it almost impossible for him to drown. "Hastur, is it really you?" asked Horus, knowing that in this place such a question was probably meaningless, but overcome with joy to see his beloved Sejanus again. He remembered the pain he had felt when his most favoured son had been hacked down upon the onyx floor of the false emperor's palace on 6319, and the chthonic bellicosity that had demanded blood vengeance. Sejanus heaved a last flood of water and propped himself up on his elbow, sucking great lungfuls of the clean air. His hand clutched at his throat as though searching for something, and he looked relieved to find it wasn't there. "My son," said Horus, as Sejanus turned towards him. He was exactly as Horus remembered him, perfect in every detail. The noble face, wide-set eyes, and firm, straight nose that could be a mirror for the War Master himself. Any thoughts that Sejanus might be a threat to him were swept away as he saw the silver shine of his eyes and knew that this surely was Hastur Sejanus. How such a thing was possible was beyond him, but he did not question this miracle for fear that it might be snatched away from him. "Commander," said Sejanus, rising to embrace Horus. "Damn me, boy. It's good to see you," said Horus. "Part of me died when I lost you." "I know, sir," replied Sejanus, as they released each other from the crushing embrace. "I felt your sorrow." "You're a sight for sore eyes, my boy," said Horus, taking a step back to admire his most perfect warrior. "It gladdens my heart to see you. But how can this be? I watched you die." "Yes," agreed Sejanus, "you did, but in truth my death was a blessing." "A blessing? How?" "It opened my eyes to the truth of the universe and freed me from the shackles of living knowledge. Death is no longer an undiscovered country, my lord. It is one from which this traveller has returned." "How is such a thing possible?" "They sent me back to you," said Sejanus. "My spirit was lost in the void, alone and dying. But I have come back to help you." Conflicting emotions surged through Horus at the sight of Sejanus. To hear him speak of spirits and voids struck a note of warning, but to see him alive once more, even if it wasn't real, was something to be cherished. "You say you're here to help me. Then help me to understand this place. Where are we?" "We don't have much time," said Sejanus, climbing the slope to the rise that overlooked the plains and forests, and taking a long look around. "He'll be here soon." "That's not the first time I've heard that recently," said Horus. "From where else have you heard it?" demanded Sejanus, turning back to face him with a serious expression. Horus was surprised at the vehemence of the question. "A wolf said it to me," said Horus. I know. It sounds ridiculous. But I swear, it really did speak to me." "I believe you, sir," said Sejanus. "That's why we need to move on." Horus sensed evasion, a trait he had never known in Sejanus before now, and said, "You're avoiding my question, Hastur. Now tell me where we are." "We don't have time, my lord," urged Sejanus. "Sejanus," said Horus, his voice that of the War Master, "tell me what I want to know." "Very well," said Sejanus, "but quickly, for your body lies on the brink of death within the walls of the Delphos on Darwin." "The Delphos? I never heard of it, and this doesn't look like Darwin." "The Delphos is a place sacred to the Lodge of the Serpent," said Sejanus, "a place of healing. In the ancient tongues of Earth, its name means the womb of the world, where a man may be healed and renewed. Your body lies in the Axis Mundi chamber, but your spirit is no longer tied to your flesh." "So, we're not really here?" asked Horus. "This world isn't real?" "No." "Then this is the warp," said Horus, finally accepting what he had begun to suspect. "Yes. None of this is real," said Sejanus, waving his hand around the landscape. "All this is but fragments of your will and memory that have given shape to the formless energy of the warp." Horus suddenly knew where he had seen this land before. Remembering the wondrous geophysical relief map of Terra they had found 10 kilometers beneath a dead world almost a decade ago. It hadn't been the Terra of their time, but one of an age long past, with green fields, clear seas, and clean air. He looked up into the sky, half expecting to see curious faces looking down on him from above, like students studying an ant colony. But the sky was empty, though it was darkening at an unnatural rate. The world around him was changing before his eyes from the earth that had once existed to the barren wasteland of Terra. Sejanus followed his gaze and said, "It's beginning." "What is?" asked Horus. "Your mind and body are dying, and this world is beginning to collapse into chaos. That's why they sent me back, to guide you to the truth that will allow you to return to your body." Even as Sejanus spoke, the sky began to waver, and he could see hints of the roiling sea of the immaterium seething behind the clouds. "You keep saying they," said Horus. "Who are they? And why are they interested in me?" "Great intelligences dwell in the warp," explained Sejanus, casting wary glances at the dissolution of the sky. "They do not communicate as we do, and this is the only way they could reach you." "I don't like the sound of this, Hastur," warned Horus. "There is no malice in this place. There is power and potential, yes, but no malice, simply the desire to exist. Events in our galaxy are destroying this realm, and these powers have chosen you to be their emissary in their dealings with the material world." "And what if I don't want to be their emissary?" "Then you will die," said Sejanus. "Only they are powerful enough to save your life now." "If they're so powerful, what do they need me for?" "They are powerful, but they cannot exist in the material universe and must work through emissaries," replied Sejanus. "You are a man of strength and ambition, and they know there is no other being in the galaxy powerful enough or worthy enough to do what must be done." Despite his satisfaction at being so described, Horus did not like what he was hearing. He sensed no deceit in Sejanus, though a warning voice in his head reminded him that the silver-eyed warrior standing before him could not truly be Sejanus. "They have no interest in the material universe. It is anathema to them. They simply wish to preserve their own realm from destruction," continued Sejanus, as the chemical reek of the world beyond the illusion returned, and a stinking wind arose. "In return for your aid, they can give you a measure of their power and the means to realize your every ambition." Horus saw the lurking world of brazen iron become more substantial, as the warp and weft of reality began to buckle beneath his feet. Cracks of dark light shimmered through the splitting earth, and Horus could hear the sound of howling wolves drawing near. "We have to move!" shouted Sejanus, as the wolf pack loped from a disintegrating copse of trees. To Horus, it sounded as though their howls desperately called his name. Sejanus ran back to the river, and a shimmering flat oblong of light rose from the boiling water. Horus heard whispers and strange mutterings issuing from beyond it, and a sense of dark premonition seized him as he switched his gaze between this strange light and the wolves. "I'm not sure about this," said Horus, as the sky shed fat droplets of acid rain. "Come on! The gateway is our only way out!" cried Sejanus, heading towards the light. "As a great man once said, towering genius disdains the beaten path. It seeks regions hitherto unexplored." "You're quoting me back to myself?" said Horus, as the wind blew in howling gusts. "Why not? Your words will be quoted for centuries to come." Horus smiled, liking the idea of being quotable, and set off after Sejanus. "Where does this gate lead?" shouted Horus over the wind and the howling of wolves. "To the truth," replied Sejanus. The crater began to fill as the sun finally set. Hundreds of vehicles of all descriptions finally completing their journey from the Imperial deployment zone to this place of pilgrimage. The Davinites watched the arrival of these convoys with a mixture of surprise and confusion, incredulous as each vehicle was abandoned and its passengers made their way towards the Delphos. Within the hour, thousands of people had gathered, and more were arriving every minute. Most of these new arrivals milled about in an undirected mass until the Davinites began circulating amongst them, helping to find somewhere that belongings could be set down and arranging shelter as a hard rain began to fall. Headlights stretched all the way along the forgotten causeway and through the valley to the plains below. As night closed in on Davin, songs in praise of the War Master filled the air, and the flickering glow of thousands of candles joined the light of the torches ringing the gold-skinned Delphos. 14. The Forgotten. Living Mythology. Primogenesis. Passing through the Gate of Light was akin to stepping from one room to another. Where once had been a world on the verge of dissolution, now Horus found himself standing amid a heaving mass of people, in a huge circular plaza surrounded by soaring towers and magnificently appointed buildings of marble. Thousands of people filled the square, and since he was half again as tall as the tallest, Horus could see that thousands more waited to enter from 9 arterial boulevards. Strangely, none of these people remarked on the sudden arrival of 2 giant warriors in their midst. A cluster of statues stood at the center of the plaza, and droning chants drifted from corroded speakers set on the buildings, as the mass of humanity marched in mindless procession around them. A pealing clangor of bells tolled from each building. "Where are we?" asked Horus, looking up at the great eagle-fronted buildings, their golden spires and their colossal stained-glass rosary windows. Each structure vied with its neighbor for supremacy of height and ostentation, and Horus's eye for architectural proportion and elegance saw them as vulgar expressions of devotion. "I do not know the name of this place," said Sejanus. "I know only what I have seen here, but I believe it to be some kind of shrine world." "A shrine world? A shrine to what?" "Not what," said Sejanus, pointing to the statues in the center of the plaza. "Who?" Horus looked more closely at the enormous statues, encircled by the thronged masses. The outer ring of statues was carved from white marble, and each gleaming warrior was clad in full Astartes battleplate. They surrounded the central figure, which was likewise armored in a magnificent suit of gold armor that gleamed and sparkled with precious gems. This figure carried a flaming torch high, the light of it illuminating everything around him. The symbolism was clear. This central figure was bringing his light to the people, and his warriors were there to protect him. The gold warrior was clearly a king or hero of some kind, his features regal and patrician, though the sculptor had exaggerated them to ludicrous proportions. The proportions of the statues surrounding the central figure were similarly grotesque. "Who is the gold statue meant to be?" asked Horus. "You don't recognize him?" asked Sejanus. "No. Should I? Let's take a closer look." Horus followed as Sejanus set off into the crowd, making his way towards the center of the plaza, and the crowds parted before them without so much as a raised eyebrow. "Can't these people see us?" he asked. "No," said Sejanus. "Or if they can, they will forget us in an instant. We move amongst them as ghosts, and none here will remember us." Horus stopped in front of a man dressed in a threadbare scapular, who shuffled around the statues on bloodied feet. His hair was tonsured, and he clutched a handful of carved bones tied together with twine. A bloody bandage covered one eye, and a long strip of parchment pinned to his scapula dangled to the ground. With barely a pause, the man stepped around him, but Horus put out his arm and prevented his progress. Again, the man attempted to pass Horus, but again he was prevented. "Please, sir," said the man without looking up. "I must get by." "Why?" asked Horus. "What are you doing?" The man looked puzzled, as though struggling to recall what he had been asked. "I must get by," he said again. Exasperated by the man's unhelpful answers, Horus stepped aside to let him pass. The man bowed his head and said, "The Emperor watch over you, sir." Horus felt a clammy sensation crawl along his spine at the words. He pushed through the unresisting crowds towards the center of the plaza as a terrible suspicion began forming in his gut. He caught up to Sejanus, who stood atop a stepped plinth at the foot of the statues, where a huge pair of bronze eagles formed the backdrop to a tall lectern. A hugely fat official in a gold chasuble and tall mitre of silk and gold read aloud from a thick, leather-bound book, his words carried over the crowd via silver trumpets held aloft by what looked like winged infants that floated above him. As Horus approached, he saw that the official was human only from the waist up, a complex series of hissing pistons and brass rods making up his lower half and fusing him with the lectern, which he now saw was mounted on a wheeled base. Horus ignored him, looking up at the statues, finally seeing them for what they were. Though their faces were unrecognizable to one who knew them as Horus did, their identities were unmistakable. The nearest was Sanguinius, his outstretched wings like the pinions of the eagles that adorned every structure surrounding the plaza. To one side of the Lord of the Angels was Rogal Dorn, the unfurled wings haloing his head, unmistakable. On the other was someone who could only be Leman Russ, his hair carved to resemble a wild mane, and wearing a cloak of wolf pelts draped around his massive shoulders. Horus circled the statues, seeing other familiar images. Gilliman, Korax, the lion, Ferus Manus, Vulcan, and finally Jagatai Khan. There could be no doubting the identity of the central figure now, and Horus looked up into the carved face of the Emperor. No doubt the inhabitants of this world thought it magnificent, but Horus knew this was a poor thing, failing spectacularly to capture the sheer dynamism and force of the Emperor's personality. With the additional height offered by the statue's plinth, Horus looked out over the slowly circling mass of people and wondered what they thought they did in this place. Pilgrims, thought Horace, the word leaping unbidden to his mind. Coupled with the ostentation and vulgar adornments he saw in the surrounding buildings, Horace knew this was not simply a place of devotion, but something much more. "This is a place of worship," he said, as Sejanus joined him at the foot of Corax's statue, the cool marble perfectly capturing the pallid complexion of his taciturn brother. Sejanus nodded and said, "It is an entire world given over to the praise of the Emperor." "But why? The Emperor is no god. He spent centuries freeing humanity from the shackles of religion. This makes no sense." "Not from where you stand in time. But this is the Imperium that will come to pass if events continue on their present course," said Sejanus. "The Emperor has the gift of foresight, and he has seen this future time." "For what purpose?" "To destroy the old faiths, so that one day his cult would more easily supplant them all." "No," said Horace. "I won't believe that. My father always refuted any notion of divinity. He once said of ancient Earth that there were torches, who were the teachers, but also extinguishers, who were the priests. He would never have condoned this." "Yet this entire world is his temple," Sejanus said, "and it is not the only one." "There are more worlds like this?" "Hundreds," nodded Sejanus. "Probably even thousands." "But the Emperor shamed Lorgar for behavior such as this," protested Horace. "The Word-Bearers' Legion raised great monuments to the Emperor and persecuted entire populations for their lack of faith. But the Emperor would not stand for it and said that Lorgar shamed him with such displays. He wasn't ready for worship then. He didn't have control of the galaxy. That's why he needed you." Horace turned away from Sejanus and looked up into the golden face of his father, desperate to refute the words he was hearing. At any other time he would have struck Sejanus down for such a suggestion, but the evidence was here before him. He turned to face Sejanus. "These are some of my brothers. But where are the others? Where am I?" "I do not know," replied Sejanus. "I have walked this place many times, but have never yet seen your likeness." "I am his chosen regent," cried Horace. "I fought on 1,000 battlefields for him. The blood of my warriors is on his hands, and he ignores me like I don't exist." "The Emperor has forsaken you, War Master," urged Sejanus. "Soon he will turn his back on his people to win his place amongst the gods. He cares only for himself and his power and glory. We were all deceived. We have no place in his grand scheme, and when the time comes he will spurn us all and ascend to godhood. While we were fighting war after war in his name, he was secretly building his power in the warp." The droning chant of the official, a priest, realized Horace, continued as the pilgrims maintained the slow procession around their god, and Sejanus's words hammered against his skull. "This can't be true," whispered Horace. "What does a being of the Emperor's magnitude do after he has conquered the galaxy? What is left for him but godhood? What use has he for those whom he leaves behind?" "No!" shouted Horace, stepping from the plinth and smashing the droning priest to the ground. The augmented preacher hybrid was torn from the pulpit and lay screaming in a pool of blood and oil. His cries were carried across the plaza by the trumpets of the floating infants, though none of the crowd seemed inclined to help him. Horace set off into the crowded plaza in a blind fury, leaving Sejanus behind on the plinth of statues. Once again, the crowd parted before his headlong dash, as unresponsive to his leaving as they had been to his arrival. Within moments he reached the edge of the plaza and made his way down the nearest of the arterial boulevards. People filled the street, but they ignored him as he pushed his way through them, each face turned in rapture to an image of the Emperor. Without Sejanus beside him, Horace realized that he was completely alone. He heard the howl of a distant wolf, its cry once again sounding as though it called out to him. He stopped in the center of a crowded street, listening for the wolf howl again, but it was silenced as suddenly as it had come. The crowds flowed around him as he listened, and Horace saw that once again no one paid him the slightest bit of attention. Not since Horace had parted from his father and brothers had he felt so isolated. Suddenly he felt the pain of being confronted with the scale of his own vanity and pride, as he realized how much he thrived on the adoration of those around him. On every face he saw the same blind devotion as he had witnessed in those that circled the statues, a beloved reverence for a man he called father. Didn't these people realize that the victories that had won their freedom had been won with Horus's blood? It should be Horus's statue, surrounded by his brother Primarchs, not the Emperor's. Horus seized the nearest devotee and shook him violently by the shoulders, shouting, "He is not a god! He is not a god!" The pilgrim's neck snapped with an audible crack as Horus felt the bones of the man's shoulders splinter beneath his iron grip. Horrified, he dropped the dead man and ran deeper into the labyrinth of the shrine world, taking turns at random as he sought to lose himself in its crowded streets. Each fevered change of direction took him along thronged avenues of worshippers and marvels dedicated to the glory of the god emperor, thoroughfares where every cobblestone was inscribed with prayer, kilometre-high ossuaries of gold-plated bones, and forests of marble columns with unnumbered saints depicted upon them. Random demagogues roamed the streets, one fanatically mortifying his flesh with prayer whips, while another held up 2 squares of orange cloth by the corners and screamed that he would not wear them. Horus could make no sense of any of it. Vast prayer ships drifted over this part of the shrine city, monstrously bloated zeppelins with sweeping brass sails and enormous prop-driven motors. Long prayer banners hung from their fat silver hulls, and hymns blared from hanging loudspeakers shaped like ebony skulls. Horus passed a great mausoleum where flocks of ivory-skinned angels with brass-feathered wings flew from dark archways and descended into the crowds gathered in front of the building. The solemn angels swooped over the wailing masses, occasionally gathering to pluck some ecstatic soul from the pilgrims, and cries of adoration and praise followed each supplicant as he was carried through the dread portals of the mausoleum. Horus saw death venerated in the coloured glass of every window, celebrated in the carvings on every door, and revered in the funereal dirges that echoed from the trumpets of winged children who giggled as they circled like birds of prey. Flapping banners of bone clattered, and the wind whistled through the eye sockets of skulls set into shrine caskets on bronze poles. Morbidity hung like a shroud upon this world, and Horus could not reconcile the dark Gothic solemnity of this new religion with the dynamic force of truth, reason, and confidence that had driven the great crusade into the stars. High temples and grim shrines passed him in a blur, Cenobites and preachers haranguing the pilgrims from every street corner to the peal of doomsayers' bells. Everywhere Horus looked, he saw walls adorned with frescoes, paintings, and bas-relief works of familiar faces, his brothers, and the emperor himself. Why was there no representation of Horus? It was as if he had never existed. He sank to his knees, raising his fists to the sky. "Father, why have you forsaken me?" The vengeful spirit felt empty to Loken, and he knew it was more than simply the absence of people. The solid, reassuring presence of the War Master, so long taken for granted, was achingly absent without him on board. The halls of the ship were emptier, more hollow, as though it were a weapon stripped of its ammunition, once powerful, but now simply inert metal. Though portions of the ship were still filled with people, huddled in small groups and holding hands around groups of candles, there was an emptiness to the place that left Loken feeling similarly hollowed out. Each group he passed swarmed around him, the normal respect for an Astartes warrior forgotten in their desperation to know the fate of the War Master. Was he dead? Was he alive? Had the Emperor reached out from Terra to save his beloved son? Loken angrily brushed each group off, pushing through them without answering their questions as he made his way to Archive Chamber 3. He knew Sindaman would be there. He was always there these days, researching and poring over his books like a man possessed. Loken needed answers about the Serpent Lodge, and he needed them now. Time was of the essence, and he'd already made one stop at the medical deck in order to hand over the anatheme to Apothecary Vadden. "Be very careful, Apothecary," warned Loken, reverently placing the wooden casket on the steel operating slab between them. "This is a Kinnebrak weapon called an anatheme. It was forged from a sentient xenometal and is utterly lethal. I believe it to be the source of the War Master's malady. Do what you need to find out what happened, but do it quickly." Vaden had nodded, dumbfounded that Loken had returned with something he could actually use. He lifted the anathame by its golden-studded pommel and placed it within a spectrographic chamber. "I can't promise anything, Captain Loken," said Vaden, "but I will do whatever is in my power to find you an answer." "That's all I ask. But the sooner the better. And tell no one that you have this weapon." Vaden nodded and turned to his work, leaving Loken to find Kirill Sinderman in the archives of the mighty ship. The helplessness that had seized him earlier vanished now that he had a purpose. He was actively trying to save the War Master, and that knowledge gave him fresh hope that there might yet be a way to bring him back unharmed in body and spirit. As always, the archives were quiet, but now there was a deeper sense of desolation. Loken strained to hear anything at all, finally catching the scratching of a quill pen from deeper in the stacks of books. Swiftly he made his way towards the sound, knowing before he reached the source that it was his old mentor. Only Kirill Sinderman scratched at the page with such intense pen strokes. Sure enough, Loken found Sinderman sitting at his usual table, and upon seeing him, Loken knew with absolute certainty that he had not left this place since last they had spoken. Bottles of water and discarded food packs lay scattered around the table, and the haggard Sinderman now sported a growth of fine white hair on his cheeks and chin. "Garville," said Sinderman, without looking up, "you came back. Is the War Master dead?" "No," replied Loken. "At least I don't think so. Not yet, anyway." Sinderman looked up from his books, the haphazard piles of which were now threatening to topple onto the floor. "You don't think so?" "I haven't seen him since I saw him on the apothecary's slab," confessed Loken. "Then why are you here? It surely can't be for a lesson on the principles and ethics of civilization. What's happening?" "I don't know," admitted Loken. "Something bad, I think. I need your knowledge of things esoteric, Kirill." "Things esoteric," repeated Sinderman, putting down his quill. "Now I am intrigued." "The Legion's Quiet Order has taken the War Master to the Temple of the Serpent Lodge on Davin. They've placed him in a temple they call the Delphos, and say that the eternal spirits of dead things will heal him." "Serpent Lodge, you say?" asked Sinderman, plucking books seemingly at random from the cluttered piles on his desk. "Serpents. Now, that is interesting." "What is?" "Serpents," repeated Sinderman. "Since the very beginnings of time, on every continent where humanity worshipped divinity, the serpent has been recognized and accepted as a god. From the steaming jungles of the Afrique Islands to the icy wastes of Alba, serpents have been worshipped, feared, and adored in equal measure. I believe that serpent mythology is probably the most widespread mythology known to mankind." "Then how did it get to Davin?" asked Loken. "It's not difficult to understand," explained Sinderman. "You see, myths weren't originally expressed in verbal or written form because language was deemed inadequate to convey the truth expressed in the stories. Myths move not with words, Garville, but with storytellers, and wherever you find people, no matter how primitive or how far they've been separated from the cradle of humanity, you'll always find storytellers. Most of these myths were probably enacted, chanted, danced, or sung, more often than not in hypnotic or hallucinatory states. It must have been quite a sight, but anyway, this method of retelling was said to allow the creative energies and relationships behind and beneath the natural world to be brought into the conscious realm. Ancient peoples believed that myths created a bridge from the metaphysical world to the physical one." Sinderman flicked through the pages of what looked like a new book, encased in fresh red leather, and turned the book so Loken could see. "Here. You see it here quite clearly." Loken looked at the pictures, seeing images of naked tribesmen dancing with long snake-topped poles, as well as snakes and spirals painted onto primitive pottery. Other pictures showed vases with gigantic snakes winding over suns, moons, and stars, while still more showed snakes appearing below growing plants or coiled above the bellies of pregnant women. "What am I looking at?" he asked. "Artifacts, recovered from a dozen different worlds during the Great Crusade," said Cinderman,